thank you all for coming along, and yeah, I'm delighted to be able to say a few words about what we're doing at LEV Foundation, the latest iteration of my crusade to bring ageing under medical control. The background, for those of you who are unfamiliar with my work, is this, which is the definition of ageing the way I see it. That essentially it consists of the lifelong accumulation of self-inflicted damage to the body that the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of, but eventually that causes the pathologies of late life. And really, I guess the single thing that I'm best known for is highlighting the possibility that the most effective way to postpone the pathologies of late life is damage repair, which I'm calling here the maintenance approach, which contrasts rather sharply with either the one disease at a time approach of attacking the pathologies directly, or for that matter, the approach of trying to make the body run more cleanly and generate damage more slowly than it naturally would. And I don't know why that title came out so extremely small, but for those of you who can't read it, this is the hallmarks of aging before hallmarks were cool. This is a paper that I published along with several distinguished colleagues in 2002, subdividing aging into 7 major categories. Actually, I think there were 9 back then. It's very gratifying that hallmarks are cool now because I don't have to spend my time justifying the damage repair approach anymore. Insofar as there are differences between the various classifications of aspects of aging that we see, I've got to say that I do still prefer my one that we're seeing here, not just because it's mine, but because one thing I feel is missing from a lot of alternative descriptions is the linkage to how we might actually do the damage repair. So here, the key thing that I want to emphasize is that we've got the same familiar types of hallmark. We've heard just a moment ago about senolytics. You'll see row 3 here says death-resistant cells, which is a slightly more general version that includes things like anergic T cells as well as actual senescent cells. But you'll see on the right corresponding modalities for actually doing the maintenance approach. And I feel that really that is the main value of presenting a classification of this type. So in the new foundation, I will be continuing to do things that are not cool yet. And the reason we're calling it the LEV Foundation is because of a concept that I introduced quite some time ago now called longevity escape velocity, which essentially encapsulates the concept that the more we can do in damage repair, in rejuvenation, the more time we have to do more still. In other words, we essentially buy ourselves time by doing incomplete damage repair so as to get progressively better at doing the more challenging, the more difficult aspects of damage repair. And way back I used to say the thing that you can see written at the bottom here, which essentially says that once we've got the first couple of decades of postponement of the health problems of late life, we will have done the hard part, and it will not take us as long as we have, as long as the time we've bought, to keep going. And this is a concept that is still pretty, scary to some people, even though the concept of damage repair and rejuvenation has become very mainstream now. So I've started a new organisation, LEV Foundation. My main scientist, Caitlin Lewis, is here in the back row, and I will be introducing her to everyone here who doesn't know her already. So is Hannah Friedenberg, our Chief of Staff, and we have a couple of other team members right here. In addition, we have the founding board of directors of the new foundation, of whom Greg Greenberg and Martin O'Dea are here. Yeah, we're quite well represented at this meeting, I'm pleased to say. But this is not the only conference at which we are quite well represented. Those of you who've been following my work for some time will be aware that I take conferences very seriously, and that since 2003 I have been organising conferences that have brought together people who would honestly not normally come to the same conference, and the consequences of that have been very positive and constructive indeed over the years. So of course the lockdown did away with conferences worldwide, and ours, which were going on every year in Berlin, were no exception. But now we have very much rebooted that with a conference series in Dublin, whose local organiser, Martin O'Dea, and his Lieutenant Beatrice are also both here. But the first conference happened last September. It was a blowout success, of course, not least because it was in Dublin, which is a great place to have the kind of conference that I like to have, with a lot of emphasis on the recreational components. So the next conference will be in August this year, and honestly, you know, I've put on some pretty stellar conferences in terms of the speaking roster over the years, but I've never quite done as well as this year. This is arguably the most illustrious speaking roster that any conference in the biology of aging has ever had, so I'm pretty happy about that. But now I want to talk briefly about the kind of work that we are doing at AV Foundation. First of all, as many of you know, at Sense Research Foundation there was a very vibrant and successful education program focused mainly on placing summer interns at various labs, including our own. And that has continued at SRF, but at AV Foundation we are progressing from there. First of all, I am delighted to have been able to seed fund and kickstart an enormously successful initiative called Less Death, which is essentially focused on retreats which educate and network newcomers to the field who may be of many different types, especially people with entrepreneurial track records. Less Death took off so successfully that we don't even have to fund them anymore, they've got other money. Afro Longevity is another one which is happening at in South Africa mainly. It's organised by two wonderful people, one from South Africa, one from Nigeria, and as I say, bringing the crusade to a whole new audience. And we're doing a fair amount in the lobbying and advocacy space. We have an organisation that we support that is working very energetically in the US Congress and elsewhere to bring the whole concept of longevity to elected representatives in a manner that they will actually listen to, which usually revolves around money. The longevity dividend concept is an old one that emphasises how financially beneficial it would be to even slightly postpone aging, and that is very much being renewed by A4LI, the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives. But the last and very much not least is the Health Span Action Coalition, whose leader Bernie Siegel is here in the audience at the back, and which is essentially bringing to the older generation as well as others the concept that the medical control of aging really is something that's within striking distance. It's a slightly flippant description to call them the antidote to the AARP, but I have a feeling it's fairly accurate. So finally, research. So let me first briefly talk about Kinice, which is a company pursuing a spectacularly promising technology for cryopreserving solid organs, and perhaps more. The idea of cryopreservation is, of course, an old one, but it's very, very difficult to do it without inducing a great deal of damage to the organs that one is preserving. And a technology called helium persiflation is being used by this new company to essentially eliminate all of that damage and thereby make organ banking an actual reality and save the most enormous number of lives of people who currently die on waiting lists. And the final thing I want to talk about is what is currently our flagship project, which is essentially to extend mean and maximum lifespan of normal mice by combination therapies. This is something which Paul actually very briefly alluded to in the end of his, in the next steps part of his remarks. We are doing a project that is very much along those lines, and it's terrifying. It's a very courageous project, I would say, definitely the most audacious mouse lifespan experiment that's ever been done. We're taking 4 different interventions in mice, one of which Paul mentioned, navitoclax, with a modification made to it to make it more specific. And we are treating all of these mice when they're already 19 months old at the beginning of the experiment, so they have about a year to live. We want to double that, take them out to living a total of maybe 3.5 years on average, maybe 4.25 years maximum. And of course we're also very much measuring the health of these mice. I won't go through all of this in too much detail, but we are testing these combinations in various subsets. And we are, of course, looking at a lot of different measures of health span. I'm just summarising very briefly here the kinds of things we're looking at, aspects of ageing that can be determined visually, like kyphosis or alopecia, ones that can be determined behaviourally, measuring memory and such like, and ones that can be determined non-invasively by, for example, taking a small blood draw. However, we're also culling some of our mice at various time points in order to do a wide variety of assays that you can't do non-invasively. One innovation that we have made is to determine when to kill those mice for that purpose, and indeed when to do some of the non-invasive measurements, not on the basis of chronological age, which is the normal way, but on the basis of what proportion of a given treatment group have actually already died. This, we feel, will give a considerably better signal-to-noise ratio from measures of health span. So that's all I want to say. I hope I've been able to leave time for a few questions, but I want to just reiterate that a lot of our team are here at this meeting and will be here throughout, so we will be very eager to let you know more throughout. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I thought I would hear from the other side this time. Don't go away. Any questions, but while you're formulating questions, I would say what I want to ask you also connects with what's happening next, which is we're in a conversation, you're almost kind of preaching to the choir in a way. We are close enough to thinking about it that it makes sense, or we can at least not be too terrified by the idea that the person who will live to 150 has already been born, for instance. That's still a little freaky to me, by the way, but I can just about take that on. But when we look at the way that conversation sits on very intense areas about mortality and really big questions for people that resonate around why we live, how we live, what do you see as the way, can you say a bit more about the ways you see of shifting the global story? Because we're all living in a story, and we are living in a very particular story about how to live.
Yeah, thank you, Desiree. This is actually a really important conversation that we've been having internally and elsewhere lately. Because as progress has been made in our lab and of course in many other labs around the world, it has, and I've been out there, doing the repeat advertising, so to speak, it's become more and more possible to have these conversations in a manner that where one takes it seriously and where it's not viewed as science fiction. And in parallel with that, there's of course been a really enormously valuable arrival of other people on the scene who are basically, giving the messaging a diversity that it used not to have. Basically saying the same kind of things that I say, but in different words and reaching and resonating with different audiences. So right now at the Foundation, we have the view that one has a spectrum of forms of words to use for different audiences. There's still an enormously important role for the more, shall we say, shameless radical approach. I wouldn't want the futurists out there who have supported our work for so long to think I've gone soft.
Yeah.
But at the same time...
I find that hard to imagine anyone would think that.
But at the same time, there's an enormous value, and that is why we're putting considerably more of our resources now than we were 5 years ago or so into outreach and advocacy. The time is right for that, we can do that much more easily.
I say that because I would not describe myself as someone who had a particularly strong interest in longevity. I mean, it kind of sat out there in the periphery for me. I was much more intrigued by what is inspired by the idea of stem cell regenerative medicine, as it speaks to a whole different way of seeing the body. But as this confluence of AI, digital health, as precision medicine comes together, it becomes clear that this is a stream within that. So you find that I think a lot more of us, as you say, are having to at least engage with it or think, well, how am I going to make sense of that within the world that I live in?